Thank you, and welcome to our session on working with private data. Well, my name is Jeff. I'm a consultant here at Thorogood. I have worked with a number of our large global customers on things like data strategies and handling of private data. And I'll be sharing some of our experiences with you today. For those of you who don't know Thorogood, we are a data and analytics services company. We come alongside the objectives of our customers and use data and technology to help them fulfill those objectives. Within that area, we offer a variety of services, again, all data and analytics focused. And the one that's particularly relevant for today are things like strategies. We do work in the area of data strategy, very much inclusive of handling sensitive data as part of our customers' organizations. As I mentioned, we work in a number of large global companies, generally in regulated industries. We've shared a sample of them here. We also will work with companies outside of these verticals on occasion as well. And in terms of the technologies that we work with and partner with a number of the organizations that are very relevant to our customers. We develop deep expertise in them, as well as a knowledge of how they work together to achieve the particular aims of our customers. And again, I've shared a sample here. The topic of working with private data, the reason that we're talking about it is because data is such an asset to our organizations. It's something that we collect, we curate, we enrich, of course, secure, and then use to create a competitive advantage. But with that asset, and like other assets, it really needs to be protected. And what's driving that protection is a number of reasons. There are a number of laws that have come into existence that make it illegal not to protect it and legal to be protecting it. It's also very much in our business interests to develop trust with our customers and consumers. And I'd even argue that there's an ethical consideration as well, that we want to be protecting data of individuals as if it were our own. So it's very important for us to do that, and it's not easy to do that. There are a number of kind of malicious attempts out there to get access to information, and it's surprising how frequent things like accidental data exposure happens. And perhaps the most cynical of all of these on the list that I've shared here is people within organizations kind of turning and getting access to information that they shouldn't, sharing information that we shouldn't. There are a number of changing reasons why we have to be particularly careful about how we protect data, and this drives a lot of focus in this area and wanting to protect information appropriately. So with that, we have an agenda today to cover off these topics. First, we'll talk a little bit about terminology so that just we can kind of level set on some of the key characteristics, key attributes that we're talking about as it relates to private data. We'll talk a little bit about anonymization and synthesis, kind of techniques for helping us reduce risk of these data sets while still making them usable. And then lastly, we'll talk about some kind of pragmatic applications for not only reducing risk, but really maximizing the value of these data sets that we have. Before I go any further, I'll just mention that this webcast is not meant to be any legal advice. This is a topic that really should be done in coordination with legal advisors. As a data and analytics firm, we work with a lot of very good advisors in this space, and if people are looking for referrals, we're happy to provide them. But we'd also suggest working with legal teams, and even when we do this sort of consulting for our customers, we work in close conjunction with information security groups and general counsel within those organizations. We suggest that others do as well. So before I get into some of the terminology that's here, one thing that's really important is as you're speaking with people is to confirm the terms that they're using and the way that they're using them. Even going customer to customer for us, sometimes people will use terms, and it's important that we kind of seek clarification behind them if they're using them in the formal definition of the legislation or using them more loosely, which does tend to happen from time to time on this topic and others. It's always useful to seek clarification. The first definition that I have up here is something that will build upon in other definitions, but talking about the individuals, typically the subjects of the data that we have. I think, again, depending on what legislation we're talking about here, some important things to note are that it's typically a natural person, a natural living person. So sometimes does not include deceased people if that's relevant to your business. It also generally doesn't include things like non-living entities such as a company or a legal entity. A couple of terms here that are similar in nature, but again, very important to get specific on it. Personal data, personal identifiable information, and protected health information. These terms are typically referring to the detailed information that has full fidelity information around the data subjects and is generally subject to more stringent requirements on how we protect that information. Again, it's important to be clear on what they are, but that's normally an indication that we need tighter controls on that. And then the phrases here, right to be forgotten, this comes under certain laws where consumers can ask to be excluded from the data set. And that's really a processing consideration to make sure that we have the capability to do that. As referenced in some of these definitions, I've also included some of the acronyms associated with this. And I'll take the time to make a point about it. A lot of this legislation does change over time. And to some degree, the legislation gives us a little bit of lead time before it actually gets enacted. And then even after it's enacted, there's a period to implement it. The thing that changes even quicker than that, based on relatively new legislation that's coming out, is the case law around it. So there are judgments being made by Supreme Courts or high courts that are interpreting these laws in different ways and can sometimes change the perception of some of the rules overnight. So it is a pretty dynamic environment and one that we need to be anticipating to some degree, but adapting to over time. An example I used here is GDPR, first passed in 2016. It was probably in the works for about 4 years before that, came into effect in 2018. And there are still judgments being made on that over time that need to be reacted to. Then to talk a little bit about some of the techniques that we have as well. The first one I'll talk about here is de-identification. And this is mostly referred to in the context of HIPAA, the US legislation around health data. And this is the process of reducing the risk of re-identifying an individual to a very small probability. The key there is very small. HIPAA makes an account for this that some of the other laws don't make an account for. And then they determine what that very small definition is by a defined set of requirements or through a particular verification process. But it is, the probability there has the possibility to be non-zero. Which is a little bit different than some of the others. Anonymization is the removal of all of the information that could identify an individual. So this is very kind of sweeping in its definition to kind of eliminate any sensitive data. And we'll come back to this when we talk about some of the techniques that we see in play. Pseudonymization and tokenization are two kind of related topics, a process by which sensitive data can be replaced by other character sets, typically meaningless character sets within data. Tokenization is a form of that pseudonymization and is generally the kind of systematic replacement of those. So defining keys to replace sensitive data and then potentially storing those keys and the retranslation of it in a very secure area and separate from the original data sets. And then lastly, encryption, which the definition is similar to some of the other ones that we have here. Generally, the encryption phrasing is being applied to data that's at rest or in transit and is applied to entire data sets using kind of statistical or mathematical techniques to really obfuscate the data that is there. So similar in approach, but generally defined on larger data sets or streams of data sets as they're being transmitted or stored. So building upon some of those definitions, we'll talk about some of the levels of anonymization and synthesis that we see in play and some of the advantages and disadvantages of each of them. So the first level up at the top here is our private data. And sometimes there's no getting around the fact that there are certain use cases within organizations that need that full fidelity data. I think that the important thing here is that we are good about identifying which cases actually need that full fidelity data and which of them don't. Generally speaking, that private data is going to be something that we do need to build some structure around, protect per the laws and good practices around that. So identifying which ones definitely need it and which ones don't or can use some of these other techniques is pretty important in our overall strategies. Pseudonymized data, generally that includes the tokenization of information. And there's kind of two ways of doing this. Data can be tokenized and we can retain those tokens and the translation back to the individuals if we ever need to be able to go back to them. Or there's also techniques where you can do the tokenization and effectively throw away the key. You might ask, well, why would you ever do the tokenization and throw away the key? But there are certain scenarios where that's very applicable. For example, it may be very helpful to identify that an individual within the web logs of an application navigated to 4 pages consecutively. That is a behavior that you want to be able to track and evaluate over time, but you don't necessarily need to know that it was Jeff Burke on certain pages of WebMD or something that actually made that progress. You just need to know what that path of information is. So there's certain cases where it's particularly applicable. The case where you may want to store the tokens, for example, is if you're doing some sort of anomaly detection on medical claims data. You don't necessarily need to know the individuals as you're applying those statistical techniques or machine learning techniques to identify where those anomalies are. But if you do identify something that either causes you to take some action or to look into further, you may need to retranslate a very small portion of that data back to those subjects to be more action-oriented about it. So the scenarios where each are in play, and again, these should be kind of tools in the tool belt to apply depending on what the organization needs. Fully anonymized data, this is generally where you remove information that will allow you to get back to those subjects. And there's a couple of ways to do that. One I've mostly talked about thus far is elimination. That's the most common way of doing it, just eliminating sensitive fields. There's also some degree of summarization or aggregation. Maybe think about the example where you have like street addresses for individuals. And even if you remove a name or a birth date or something, if you still identify somebody's home, it's pretty easy to work out who you might be dealing with. But if you aggregate that information up to a postcode level or even higher than that, portions of postcodes, that's something where you can anonymize that information beyond a particular degree. Again, subject to any laws or considerations around it in a way that makes sense to do. Some other techniques that we see are things like redacting. So within the body of a text, removing mentions to somebody's names or identifiers as part of that, or even masking. So on a data attribute by data attribute basis, you could mask things so that you can still identify it as, say, a telephone number or even the last 4 digits of a telephone number that doesn't uniquely identify a subject, but still gives you a sense of what the information is behind it. It's generally at this point where this data can be declassified within some of the legal constructs. So if you can take it to a point where there is no possible way to get back to the individual subjects, you generally don't need to abide by the strong structures that are in place by some of the laws and legislation that are out there. Again, of course, all of that needs to be double checked, but that generally gets there. The thing that is particularly tricky about this level is if you end up removing so much of the value of the information by doing these elimination techniques. So one of the things that needs to be balanced is whether or not, if you eliminate all of those aspects of that data, whether it still has utility to be used within the organization. And the last one here is around synthetic data. And the synthesizing of data generally uses machine learning techniques to manipulate the information, remove any identities within it, and even introduce things like white noise to data sets so that individual representations are completely not identifiable within the data set itself. This technique also has some other potential benefits in that the same or similar machine learning techniques can be used to prepare that data for other machine learning trainings that might need to happen. So for example, If the data set contains biases within the pattern of data, those biases can be further balanced so that the models being trained on them can get a more appropriate data set to train and react to going forward. The other scenario is if there is a particular sequence or experience that you want to be able to train your models on. These can be kind of extrapolated within these data sets so that we have a good basis to train those models on. I will say that synthetic data is not for every use case. Obviously, if we're introducing things like records or white noise to data sets, it may very well distort some of the traditional properties that we might use that data set for. So for example, if we have a data set full of claims at an insurance company, if we were to introduce white noise to that, it might distort the count of those claims over time. For that use case, we might need to use a different anonymization technique. But if we're just looking at the statistical properties of the pattern of claims within that data set, more than likely we can use some of these techniques to preserve those properties, fully anonymize the data, and even take advantage of some of these other benefits. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the techniques whereby we see the ability to really make use of those data assets that we have while also reducing the risks where we can. And I'm not going to go through a lot of the kind of general information security structures that are in place, things like the technology controls that we have available to us around our firewalls and infrastructure and networks and whatnot. I'll talk about some more of the application techniques in this area. And the first two I'll talk about here is the ones that we've been talking about through the definitions and techniques. Tokenizing data and synthesizing data. Really, what's behind this is to be able to classify how we're using information to determine kind of what level of anonymization is required. But typically these techniques will be techniques that we can put in play depending on what those use cases are. And the next one that I have on here is called creating private data labs. And this is techniques we've employed at a number of places where we know that there is going to be use cases around sensitive data. And what we do is we build a research lab environment whereby that exploration of that data can be done in a controlled way. It's also a good way to communicate within the organization to show that data going into that lab is very controlled. It only goes into it to be able to analyze insights and whatnot. And if anything were to come out of that lab, it's done in a very controlled way. Perhaps a machine learning model that has been trained, or if it's an insight, it goes through kind of appropriate approvals for it to come out of that. We do have a whole webcast on that topic called Data Science Workspaces. You can either Google that with Thorogood. If you want to reach out to me, I can point you to that one as well. Another one here that typically is associated with more strategic kind of data and analytics topics, I think is very relevant here, is bringing self-service out of the shadows. We see a lot of customer organizations with different degrees of self-service. Some people say they're doing self-service, but it still takes several weeks for people to get provisioned access to data, or the environments that they have are controlled in such a way where there's very little freedom to be able to do things like data discovery. What we want to do is, if people are too tightly restricted, they shouldn't, but oftentimes they'll find ways to be working with information, and perhaps ways that we wouldn't encourage them to do it. People will pull data onto their desktops or bring data together in different ways. Kind of having good responsive self-service approaches where people can make use of the data that we have in our modern data architectures, data lakes, data warehouses, lake houses, and have the tools and enough freedom to be able to work with that in ways where it is out there for organizations to be aware of it and to guide people on it is a technique so that things aren't in the shadows where they could be at even higher risk. Learning data responsibility, I think everybody at this point will go through requisite information security training, and I think that's absolutely important to do. But what I think is also helpful is coming at this from the direction of enablement and empowerment, using data as the asset that it is, but recognizing that some use cases require full fidelity private data, some use cases don't. educating people on different ways to anonymize data or different facilities within organizations to make use of that data at kind of different degrees of anonymization. And that can be built into some of that enablement and empowerment programs that exist at a lot of these large organizations. And then last but not least, even if everybody's doing everything right within their organizations, I also do advise that there are some fail-safes that exist out there. In particular, having some of this monitoring and auditing software deployed within our networks. One, sometimes it's a requirement based on the environments that we're operating in, either regulatory or due to the countries that we're operating in. But also because it's a fail-safe. Even if you have all the information out there, to have software that's out there that is alerting when different patterns of activity are happening that are anomalous. It's kind of a fail-safe and a check to see if somebody is starting to scrape a lot of information off your network and pick up some of the harder to find aspects of data and how people are using it. So a good fail-safe. Again, we've used different software in that space, and happy to make some referrals there too. So with that, just some concluding points here on what we talked about today. I've mentioned a couple of times, it's really identifying how people are using data and what level of sensitive data they need to use. Sometimes it has to be full fidelity data. Oftentimes they can use some variation of that reduces the risk and begins to fulfill the responsibilities that we have in regard to the legislation that's out there and is evolving. One of the really important things here is that it can be tempting to be overly restrictive when it comes to different data sets. And it is absolutely important to have sufficient levels of protection and to really make sure that we're behaving in the ways that we have to be. But there's also a balance there of being able to make use of that information in a way that keeps organizations competitive. And I think that's one of the most crucial judgments that's being made in this area. Of course, technical safeguards are the foundation of information security, and they absolutely have to be out there. I haven't gone into detail about the safeguards here, but there are a number of technical safeguards out there that are important. But as we saw at the beginning with some of the ways that data breaches happen, it's really can be about people. And that's something that we can also address through a variety of programs. Again, a lot of that being led from information security groups, but I think it can also be addressed and led from kind of using data as an asset and the enablement empowerment programs that we have available. And then the kind of fail-safe that I mentioned on the last slide, monitoring usage is something that is an addition to some of these techniques that catches things at the very end. So, and then lastly, of course, this topic is very critical for organizations out there, and it may be worth getting a second view at it or getting some help in the area. And of course, we're always here to help and have a look at data strategies and how we can kind of draw a balance in terms of using information and also making sure that the protection is in there and up to industry practices. So with that, I'll close today's session. As I mentioned throughout, if anything comes up, if you have a quick question or if we can refer you to any of the topics that I mentioned, by all means, reach out to me. Thanks for attending.